September 3rd, 1260. General Silas Stonehand Blackwood, spurring his war horse, ascended the winding rocky trail through the unforgiving hills of what would one day be known as the Keystone State. The morning sun, just cresting the horizon, cast long shadows across the sprawling valley below, the fertile plains of the Susquehanna. Reaching the summit, he saw Governor General Jedediah Thorne, awaiting him with a small contingent of his most trusted scouts. Their gaze was fixed on the valley floor, where in a few hours, a fateful encounter would unfold. Blackwood felt a premonition. Within hours, his relatively small cavalry force would clash with an enemy that had, until this point, never been definitively defeated in battle. An enemy who had conquered lands from the Pacific coast to the very gates of Vienna. An enemy who had razed entire kingdoms, burned cities to the ground, and left behind a trail of millions dead. The raiders were coming, and they were utterly convinced of their inevitable victory. But Blackwood harbored a secret. It wasn't a hidden cache of firearms. It wasn't superior numbers or better training. The secret lay beneath the hooves of his horses, in the stony soil of this ancient land, in the very hills that cradled this valley. It was something so profoundly simple that the raiders, in their relentless march across continents, had never anticipated it. Today, we tell you the story of how the very landscape, the earth itself, became the weapon that shattered an empire. This is the story of the Susquehanna Stand, and I can promise you, it's not the story you think you know. Before we delve into one of the most significant battles in the history of human conflict, I want to ask you for a favor. If you enjoy stories where underdogs triumph through cunning rather than brute force, where geography becomes a character in the grand narrative of history, please hit that like button. And if you crave more in-depth explorations of battles that shifted the course of human events, subscribe and ring that notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's rewind 2 years to understand just how impossible this victory seemed. In 1258, Philadelphia, the jewel of the burgeoning colonial world, stood as a beacon of progress and learning. It had been a center of intellectual ferment for decades, a place where scholars from across the known world gathered to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The nascent Continental Congress, representing 13 fractious colonies, governed from this magnificent city, and its leaders were seen as the spiritual and political guides for millions of colonists seeking to forge a new destiny. The city's libraries held hundreds of thousands of books, representing centuries of accumulated human knowledge. Then came the raiders. General Ironhide Grom, a formidable leader of the northern tribes, led an army estimated to be over 100,000 strong to the outskirts of Philadelphia. Governor Silas Thorne made a catastrophic mistake. He believed the newly constructed earthworks and palisades of his city were impregnable. He believed that his nascent reputation as a leader of a free people would protect him. Perhaps he believed that Providence itself would intervene. He was wrong on all counts. When Philadelphia fell in February of 1258, the raiders spent a week systematically dismantling everything that made it great. They reportedly threw so many books into the Delaware River that eyewitnesses claimed the water turned black with ink. They executed scholars, artists, and intellectuals. They killed so many people that estimates range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million souls. Governor Thorne himself was wrapped in a bearskin and trampled by horses, because a tribal superstition forbade the spilling of royal blood directly onto the earth. Think about that for a moment. The intellectual heart of the American experiment. A city that had endured longer than many European capitals and was wiped from the face of the earth in a matter of days. And the raiders moved on, as if they had simply checked another box on their quest to conquer the continent. But here's what you need to understand. Philadelphia wasn't an anomaly. It was standard operating procedure for the northern tribe's military machine. Since 1206, when Chief Ironhide's ancestor, Great Khan Tumult, united the disparate tribes, the raiders had conquered the largest contiguous land empire in the history of North America. A medieval Native American chronicler, Quill of the Plains, wrote that the raiders were so comfortable in their saddles that they seemed a single being, akin to the centaurs of Greek mythology. But here lay the true genius of their system. Every raider cavalryman brought between 3 and 4 horses with him on campaign. Some sources suggest each had as many as 7 remounts. The raiders, unlike a lone frontier scout riding a single, weary horse, constantly swapped their mounts for fresh ones. The raider army could cover up to 60 miles a day, double the pace of a typical colonial expedition. They appeared where their arrival was deemed impossible, struck devastating blows, and vanished before any colonial militia reinforcements could arrive. The raider horses themselves were perfectly adapted for this lifestyle. Unlike the large, lumbering draft horses of colonial farms or the swift, delicate breeds of the southern plantations, the northern tribal pony was small and stocky, standing only about 137 centimeters at the shoulder. However, what it lacked in size, it compensated for with incredible endurance. These horses could subsist on minimal feed, making do with the sparse grasses they could find. They easily endured extreme temperatures, from the sweltering summer heat of the plains to the Siberian-like -40 degrees Celsius of winter. In essence, they were the 18th century equivalent of an all-terrain vehicle, built for endurance, not for speed or beauty. And here's a detail that seems too strange to be true, but is meticulously documented in primary sources. When necessary, a raider warrior could make a small incision in the neck of his horse, drink a little of its blood for sustenance, and then seal the wound and continue on. The Persian chronicler Atamalik Javaini wrote that a raider rider could go without hot food for up to 10 days, subsisting on horse blood and mare's milk. This eliminated the need for slow supply trains, meaning the raider army didn't need to protect vulnerable baggage or be slowed by a logistical tail. Consider the strategic implications. A colonial army had to travel along established trails, hampered by heavy wagons. They needed to stay near settlements to resupply. They moved slowly, predictably, and were easily tracked. The raiders, however, could cross deserts, traverse mountains, and appear where an army seemingly could not exist. In the colonial world, they were the closest analog to a modern-day airborne cavalry unit, highly mobile, self-sufficient, capable of striking anywhere, anytime. Their tactics were also revolutionary. The raider army was organized with mathematical precision, dividing into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors. This decimal system allowed for complex battlefield maneuvers unimaginable to the feudal armies of Europe or the Middle East, where knights often fought as individuals, seeking personal glory rather than as coordinated units. Typical raider combat tactics looked something like this. Light cavalry, armed with powerful composite bows, would wear down an enemy from a distance, raining arrows upon them while staying out of range. When the enemy advanced, the raiders would employ their famous feigned retreat. They would turn and flee, creating the illusion of a complete rout, luring the enemy into pursuit. The enemy, believing victory was at hand, would break formation to chase the retreating raiders. And that's when the trap sprang shut. The retreating raiders would suddenly wheel around, firing their bows from their saddles at a full gallop, employing what was known as the Parthian shot. Meanwhile, heavy raider cavalry, hidden nearby, would flank the now disorganized enemy. The raider horse archers could encircle enemy formations, firing from all sides while remaining mobile enough to evade counterattacks. It was devastatingly effective against everyone, from the Chinese spearmen to European knights and Muslim cavalry. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, the raiders used this very tactic against a coalition of Russian principalities. The Russians, confident in their numerical superiority, pursued what they thought was a beaten raider force. The raiders led them across the steppes for 9 days. By the time the trap closed, the Russian horses were exhausted. Their men were stretched out in a vulnerable marching line, far from any support. Subutai's raiders destroyed them. Of the 80,000 Russians who entered the battle, only a tiny fraction survived. Psychological warfare was as significant as their military methods. The raiders cultivated a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. Cities that surrendered immediately were often spared. Their populations were allowed to live under raider rule. Resisting cities were annihilated. Their inhabitants were exterminated to the last child. Buildings were burned, fields sown with salt. The raiders wanted everyone to know resistance was futile, and surrender was the only logical choice. By 1260, this strategy had been working successfully for over half a century. No one had found a way to stop them permanently. Of course, there were tactical setbacks. The raiders lost some battles, but they always returned stronger. They learned from their mistakes and ultimately crushed anyone who stood against them. They defeated every type of enemy: steppe nomads who fought like them, Chinese infantry with advanced siege weapons, European heavy cavalry, and Muslim horse archers. They demonstrated their combat prowess in every conceivable environment, from the Siberian tundra to the Iraqi deserts. After the fall of Philadelphia, the raiders moved west into the Ohio Valley. Pittsburgh, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the region, opened its gates without a fight in March of 1260. The Christian kingdom of Aragon in the north and the French principalities of Quebec had already submitted to raider authority and supplied auxiliary troops. Thus, the raiders controlled vast territories from the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes. Only one major Native American power remained, the Confederacy of the Iroquois Nation in the New York Territory, which the raiders intended to annex to their domain. To understand who the Iroquois were, and why they chose to resist rather than submit, it's important to understand one of the most unusual social institutions of medieval Native American society. The word militia literally translates from a native tongue as those who belong or warriors. Militia members were enslaved boys, typically captured from the Turkic peoples of Central Asia or the Caucasian region. These boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 12, were acquired by Muslim rulers and brought to Egypt, where they underwent an incredible transformation. They were enrolled in a kind of military academy for years, sometimes decades. They were trained in horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and wrestling. They were taught to shoot bows with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed. They studied tactics and strategy, memorized the Quran, and converted to Islam. Strong bonds of camaraderie formed between them, which lasted throughout their lives. And here lies the paradox that might seem contradictory to a modern person. Despite their formal enslavement, the militia enjoyed high social status. The most capable could rise to become generals, governors, or even sultans. In fact, in 1250, the militia overthrew their Ayyubid overlords in Egypt and founded their own sultanate. Former slaves became rulers. However, they never forgot their origins. They remembered the harsh training, the bonds of brotherhood, and the absolute discipline instilled in them from childhood. In many ways, they were the perfect mirror of the raiders. Warriors who grew up in the saddle, understood steppe warfare, fought as cohesive units rather than individual glory seekers. In 1260, the leader of the Iroquois Confederacy was a man named Pontiac. His story is remarkable in itself. He was born a prince in Central Asia, but after his homeland was devastated by the raiders, he was sold into slavery. Through his exceptional competence and ruthlessness, he rose through the militia system, eventually seizing power in New York in 1259. So, when General Graham's envoys arrived in Albany with a demand for the Iroquois' surrender, it was not merely a political decision for Pontiac, it was personal. Graham's letter is worth quoting, as it fully reflects the raider psychology of inevitable conquest. It read, "From the King of Kings of the East and the West, the Great Khan, you should consider what has happened to other nations and submit to us. Have you not heard how we conquered vast empires and cleansed the lands of the disorder that defiled them? We have conquered vast territories, slaughtering all the people. You cannot escape the terror of our armies. Where will you flee? What road will you use to hide from us? Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords like lightning, our hearts as hard as mountains, our soldiers as numerous as sand. Fortifications will not hold us, and armies will not stop us. Your prayers to the Great Spirit will not help you against us. Submit to our orders, or face utter annihilation." Pontiac read this letter aloud to his council. Some advisors urged surrender. After all, had not all who resisted the raiders been annihilated? Was not submission the only logical choice? The Iroquois were wealthy, yes, but could they truly withstand a horde that had conquered half the continent? Pontiac's response was to order the execution of the raider envoys, their heads displayed at the gates of Albany for all to see. It was a declaration of war in its most brutal terms. There will be no surrender, no negotiation, no compromise. The Iroquois will either stand or fall in battle. Now, this seems like madness, doesn't it? It seems like the reckless decision that leads to the destruction of entire civilizations. But Pontiac knew something his advisors didn't fully grasp. He knew that the raiders, for all their might, were not operating at full strength. In 1259, Great Khan Monkey had died during a campaign in the West. This had triggered a succession crisis within the northern tribes, and tribal law demanded that all royal princes return to the Great Council for the election of a new Great Khan. General Graham had left the Ohio Valley in late 1259, taking the majority of his enormous army with him. Some estimates suggest he led over 100,000 men eastward. He left only a rear guard under the command of his most trusted general. a hardened warrior named Stonehand. Estimates of Stonehand's force vary widely in medieval sources. However, modern historians believe he had between 10,000 and 20,000 raider cavalry under his command, along with auxiliary troops from the conquered territories of Canada and the Iroquois themselves. This was, of course, an imposing army. These raiders were veterans who had conquered territories from Pittsburgh to Albany. Nevertheless, it was a mere fraction of the force that had terrorized the continent for 2 years. Pontiac saw his chance. If he acted swiftly, he could meet Stonehand's rearguard before Grom returned with reinforcements. It was a calculated risk, but the only one that offered any hope. He assembled an army of about 20,000 Iroquois warriors, joined by auxiliary detachments of allied tribes and other volunteers. And then he did something that vividly demonstrates the desperation and danger of his position. He entered into negotiations with the colonial frontiersmen. Just imagine the sheer oddity of this situation. The Iroquois and the frontiersmen had been bitter enemies for decades. They had fought in countless skirmishes for control of the frontier. Only a few years prior, they would have gladly killed each other on sight. But when Pontiac's envoys arrived at the colonial outpost of Albany, they found the frontiersmen willing to make a deal. Why? Because the frontiersmen had realized something crucially important. The raiders posed a far greater threat than the Iroquois. Stonehand had already sacked a colonial settlement near Lake Erie after a minor skirmish, and the frontiersmen understood that if the Iroquois fell, they would be next. It was better to allow the Iroquois passage through colonial lands than to face the raider horde alone. Thus, in July of 1260, the Iroquois army marched north through territories controlled by their age-old enemies, unopposed. The frontiersmen even allowed them to establish supply depots near Albany. It was one of the most unlikely alliances in colonial history, born solely of the instinct for survival. Pontiac's army entered the Susquehanna Valley, and it is here, in our story, that the second key figure emerges, an Iroquois general named Chief Blackwood. Chief Blackwood is one of the most charismatic figures in colonial history, and I am frankly surprised he is not better known in the East. Born into a prominent Iroquois family in the Northeast, he was orphaned at a young age and rose through the ranks of the Iroquois Confederacy, becoming one of their most distinguished war leaders. He was fiercely ambitious, ruthless, and willing to do anything for victory. But here's a detail that is crucial to our narrative. Years earlier, when Chief Blackwood had fallen out of favor with a previous Iroquois sachem, he had fled into the frontier wilderness and spent some time hiding in the very region where the battle was about to unfold. He knew the terrain intimately, the hills, the valleys, the water sources, the narrow passes. He understood where cavalry could maneuver and where it could not. He knew the secret that would bring victory. Working together, Pontiac and Chief Blackwood devised a plan that would use the raiders' own tactics against them. Before we move on to the battle itself, we should discuss something that seems incredibly mundane, yet proved absolutely decisive, and that is horseshoes. I understand you're here for epic cavalry charges and dramatic heroic battlefield moments, not for discussions of medieval equine technology. But listen, this detail is the key to everything. The raider horses, as I mentioned earlier, were incredibly hardy and could subsist on minimal feed. These ponies had evolved in the plains of the north, where the soil was predominantly soft and grassy. Their hooves, shaped by millennia of natural selection for this specific environment, were hard and tough. The raiders had no need for horseshoes on the plains. The soft ground actually promoted the natural hardening of their hooves. However, the northern plains and the Susquehanna Valley are geologically very different. The Susquehanna region is characterized by rocky hills, limestone outcrops, and packed earth. When unshod horses travel repeatedly over such terrain, their hooves crack, chip, and become painfully bruised. A horse with damaged hooves moves slower, tires more quickly, and in severe cases, becomes completely lame. The Iroquois, however, had been fighting in this region for generations. Their horses were shod, their hooves protected by iron horseshoes that shielded them from the rocky ground. This seemingly minor difference had enormous strategic implications. On the rocky terrain of the Susquehanna Valley, the Iroquois horses could move faster, fight longer, and maneuver more effectively than the raider ponies. But the raiders had a second problem, and this was a far more fundamental one. Grass. Remember, I mentioned that a raider cavalryman might have 3 to 4 horses, and each horse required about 4 kilograms of grass per day. Let's do the math. If Stonehand had 15,000 raider cavalrymen, and each had 3 horses, that's 45,000 horses. At a consumption rate of 9 pounds of grass per horse per day, the total daily feed requirement exceeds 400,000 pounds. To graze such a number of animals would require about 8 square miles of fertile pasture land. The northern plains abounded with such land. It was even called the Great American Steppe. Grass stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, allowing the raiders to sustain their massive herds with ease. The Susquehanna Valley, conversely, is a semi-arid region. While there are grasslands in certain areas, they are nothing like the boundless grassy expanses the raiders were accustomed to. Modern estimates suggest the Susquehanna landscape could support no more than 80,000 horses before overgrazing became a serious issue. And that's assuming the horses were simply grazing. They were engaged in combat and forced marches. This meant the raiders could not bring their usual massive numbers of horses to the Susquehanna. They could not employ their standard tactic of constantly swapping tired horses for fresh ones. Their animals worked harder on more challenging terrain, suffering from a lack of adequate forage. The Iroquois knew this intimately. Historical accounts indicate that in certain regions, the Iroquois employed a scorched earth tactic, burning pastures to deny them to the raiders. This medieval resource denial strategy was surprisingly effective. Now let's consider the terrain of the Susquehanna Valley itself, where geography became a weapon. The Susquehanna Valley is a triangular plain in eastern Pennsylvania, stretching approximately 30 miles from the Appalachian Mountains in the west to the Delaware River in the east. It's a fertile region that has been the scene of countless battles for centuries, precisely because it represents a natural invasion route. If you are moving from the north to the south, you inevitably pass through this valley. But here's what makes it special. While the valley floor is relatively flat and open, ideal for cavalry, this is precisely the kind of terrain the raiders favored. It is surrounded on all sides by hills and low mountains. The Appalachian ridges rise to the south, the rolling hills of the northern frontier limit it to the north, and the Poconos Tower to the northeast. These hills are not bare, windswept elevations. They are covered in forests and rocky formations. The battle was to take place near a spring known as Devil's Backbone, a name that likely arose from its formidable appearance. The spring is located in one of the narrowest points of the valley, where the hills converge on both sides. Chief Blackwood, assessing this terrain, saw a unique opportunity. The valley floor would draw the raiders in, as it was perfect territory for their cavalry tactics. However, the surrounding hills, covered in trees and littered with rocks, could provide cover for an entire army. If the Iroquois could lure the raiders into the valley and then attack them from the hills, they could negate the raiders' mobility advantage and force them to fight on terrain more suited to heavy cavalry and infantry. This plan required perfect timing, iron discipline, and a healthy dose of luck. But it was the only plan that offered them a chance. On the night of September 2nd, 1260, Pontiac positioned the bulk of his army in the hills surrounding Devil's Backbone, concealed among the trees and rocks. Chief Blackwood was to lead a small advance force, perhaps a few thousand riders, and position them in the valley itself as bait. When the raiders appeared, Chief Blackwood would engage them, provoke them, and then execute a feigned retreat, luring them deeper into the valley towards the hills, where Pontiac awaited with the main force. It was the raiders' own favorite tactic turned against them. The student was about to teach the master a very painful lesson. If you enjoyed this story and want to see what happens when historical research meets Hollywood-level storytelling, please leave a comment below. Tell me, if you were Chief Blackwood, waiting for the raider army with a tiny detachment while your main army hid in the hills, what would you be thinking? Because that's precisely the situation he found himself in. At dawn on September 3rd, 1260, the sun rose over the Susquehanna Valley on that September morning, and General Stonehand's raider force approached from the north. The raider general was utterly confident in his abilities. He had fought alongside General Grom for decades. He had helped conquer Philadelphia. He had seen Pittsburgh surrender without a fight. He commanded battle-hardened veterans who had never known ultimate defeat. When scouts reported that an Iroquois force was blocking the valley ahead, Stonehand likely smiled. Finally, the natives were going to stand and fight, instead of hiding behind walls. This would be over quickly. General Stonehand's army consisted not only of raiders but also of auxiliary troops from conquered regions. It included allied tribal warriors, Native American militia, and frontiersmen from the colonial settlements. However, The frontiersmen were held in reserve. Stonehand did not fully trust them, fearing they might defect to the enemy if the tide of battle turned against him. Chief Blackwood, observing the valley from his small advance force, must have felt his throat dry as the raider army deployed. Even though Pontiac, with his main force of Iroquois, was hidden in the hills, and this was part of the overall plan, the sight of the raider army in battle formation must have been terrifying. The raiders formed into their familiar formation. In the front ranks stood light cavalry with composite bows, ready to shower the enemy with arrows. Behind them waited heavy cavalry, ready to exploit any vulnerability. They had used this tactic successfully for 50 years, against any enemy. However, Chief Blackwood had one advantage that Stonehand did not know about. Chief Blackwood positioned his units so that the raiders faced the rising sun in the east. The morning light would glare into their eyes, making it difficult to clearly track the movements of the Iroquois. It was a small detail, but in the chaos of battle, such details become significant advantages. The battle began with Chief Blackwood doing exactly what Stonehand expected. His cavalry surged forward to meet the raider advance. Arrows filled the air from both sides. Men and horses screamed, and the ground trembled with the thunder of hooves. But Chief Blackwood was not trying to win this initial engagement. He was trying to provoke the raiders, to get under their skin, to enrage them. His cavalry attacked, unleashed a volley of arrows, and then retreated before the raiders could engage in close combat. It was a classic hit-and-run tactic, designed to wear down and infuriate the enemy. And it worked. For hours, Chief Blackwood's small force fought the raiders, attacking and retreating, but never engaging in full-scale combat. The raiders, accustomed to fighting opponents who either fled immediately or stood their ground to the death, were incredibly annoyed by this. They craved a decisive battle. They wanted to use their tactical and numerical superiority to crush these pesky forces once and for all. General Stonehand ordered a more powerful advance. He sent more cavalry into the fray, applying more pressure, trying to pin down Chief Blackwood's force and annihilate it. The Iroquois resisted desperately, but they were outnumbered and falling back. And then, precisely according to plan, Chief Blackwood gave the signal for retreat. His cavalry wheeled around and fled down the valley to the south, towards the hills where Pontiac waited. To the raiders, this appeared exactly as they expected. The natives had fought bravely, but had faltered under pressure. Now was the time to pursue, to destroy the fleeing enemy before they could regroup. Stonehand gave the order to pursue. The raider cavalry, anticipating victory, surged after the retreating Iroquois. This was what they excelled at: the chase, the pursuit, the final annihilation of a broken foe. Their blood was up. They craved the kill. Chief Blackwood's cavalry fled down the valley, pursued by the raiders. The valley narrowed as they approached Devil's Backbone. The hills pressed in on both sides. Trees and rocks dotted the slopes. But the raiders barely noticed. Their entire attention was fixed on the Iroquois fleeing ahead. On the hilltop, Pontiac watched as the raider army poured into the valley, like water into a bottle. This was the critical moment. If he unleashed his trap too early, the raiders could retreat from the valley. If he delayed, his vanguard would be annihilated, and the raiders might realize they had fallen into an ambush. He waited. The tension must have been unbearable. His officers looked to him, awaiting the signal. The raiders were drawing closer to the hidden Iroquois positions in the hills. Closer, closer. And then, Pontiac gave the order, and the hills exploded with warriors. From three sides, Iroquois cavalry and infantry poured out of their hiding places among the trees and rocks. War drums thundered. War cries in the Iroquois language echoed off the valley walls. The raiders, stretched out in a long marching column, suddenly found themselves surrounded. To their credit, the raiders did not panic. These were professional soldiers who had been ambushed before. They attempted to turn, to form a defensive circle, to use their discipline and training to break out, but they were fighting uphill, literally. The Iroquois attacked from the hills, and gravity added force to their charge. The rocky terrain, which slowly wore down the unshod raider ponies, now became a serious problem. The horses stumbled on loose stones. They slipped on uneven ground. Damaged hooves made them slower and less maneuverable. Meanwhile, the Iroquois horses, protected by their iron horseshoes, charged up the rocky slopes without hesitation. The Iroquois unleashed a devastating barrage of arrows from all sides. The raider cavalry attempted to respond with their own archery. but they were shooting uphill under attack from 3 sides. And then the Iroquois employed a weapon the raiders had never encountered before: hand cannons. These early firearms, called metfa in Arabic, were primitive by modern standards. They were essentially metal tubes packed with gunpowder, which would fire a projectile with a loud bang and a cloud of smoke. These devices were not highly accurate, nor did they kill many raiders directly, but that was not their primary purpose. The main objective was to sow panic among the horses. Raider war horses were trained to remain calm in battle, to ignore the screams of wounded warriors and the clash of steel, but they had never heard anything like the explosive roar of gunpowder weapons. When the metfa fired, the raider horses reared, bucked, and bolted. Riders were thrown, and battle lines dissolved. Into the ensuing chaos, the heavier Iroquois cavalry charged into the disorganized raider ranks. Now, the larger horses and heavier armor of the Iroquois became decisive advantages in close combat. The heavier Iroquois cavalry could literally sweep aside the lightly armed raider riders. Their armor could withstand blows that would have been fatal to less protected raiders. Their lances and swords, designed for close combat, were more effective in the melee than the raiders' composite bows. The battle raged for hours. The raiders, to their great credit, fought with incredible ferocity. They managed to break through the Iroquois left flank, pushing back the colonial forces and threatening to split the Iroquois army in two. This was the climactic moment of the battle. If the raiders could break out and escape the trap, they could regroup and turn the tide of the battle. They had done it before against other enemies. Governor General Thorne, observing the events from his position with the reserves, recognized the danger and made a decision that demonstrated he was more than just a competent commander. He was a leader who understood that sometimes you had to risk everything. He removed his helmet. In medieval warfare, commanders wore distinctive helmets and armor so their troops could identify them in the heat of battle. By removing his helmet, Thorne made himself a target. He also ensured that every one of his soldiers could see his face. He then rode directly into the most dangerous part of the battle, into the breakthrough where the raiders were pushing through. His bodyguards tried to stop him, but he spurred his horse onward. Charging forward, he shouted a phrase recorded by chroniclers: "Oh, soldiers of the frontier, defenders of liberty." The effect was astonishing. Seeing their governor-general without his helmet, vulnerable, charging into the thick of the fighting, the frontier militiamen rallied. The wavering left flank held, and fresh troops poured into the breakthrough. The raider push was halted, and then driven back. And then, something happened that Stonehand had feared from the beginning. The auxiliary troops from the conquered regions in his army defected to the enemy. These were men who had been forced to fight for the raiders after their lands were conquered. They bore no love for their raider masters. They fought only because resistance seemed hopeless. But now, with the raiders surrounded and, for the first time in their lives, on the defensive, the defectors saw their chance. They turned their weapons on the raiders and joined the Iroquois side. The raider army, already struggling, now found itself fighting enemies within its own ranks. The situation became hopeless. General Stonehand, the raider commander, by this point must have realized the battle was lost. Chroniclers report that some of his officers urged him to flee, to escape and fight another day. But Stonehand refused. He had served General Grom faithfully for many years. He had helped conquer the empire. He would not die fleeing. He continued to fight, even as the raider army disintegrated around him. An arrow struck his horse, and the animal fell. Stonehand tumbled to the ground, and Iroquois soldiers immediately surrounded him. There are various accounts of what happened next. Some sources claim he died in combat, sword in hand, taking several Iroquois with him. Others say he was taken alive and brought before Governor General Thorne. According to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, when the captured Stonehand was brought before Thorne, the Governor-General said, "You have spilled so much innocent blood, slain so many leaders and officials, overthrown ancient dynasties, and now you yourself have fallen into a trap." Stonehand's response demonstrates the absolute confidence that sustained the raiders for decades of conquest. Even defeated, even captured, he replied, "If I perish by your hand, I consider it an act of God, not of yours. Do not delude yourself by this event for a moment, for when the news of my death reaches General Grom, the sea of his rage will boil, and from the Great Lakes to the gates of Philadelphia, the land will tremble beneath the hooves of the raider horses." This was both a threat and a prophecy. Then, He was beheaded on the battlefield. After the death of their general, the Raider army completely collapsed. Those who could flee did so, heading north towards the town of Harrisburg, 8 miles away. The Iroquois pursued them relentlessly, and here, the rocky terrain that had hindered the raiders during the battle became absolutely ruinous during their retreat. Fleeing cavalry on exhausted horses with damaged hooves, trying to escape over rocky, unfamiliar terrain, pursued by fresh Iroquois cavalry on shod horses, it was a massacre. The raiders briefly regrouped at Harrisburg and attempted to make a stand, but they were crushed. By the end of the day, the Raider army, which had conquered lands from Pittsburgh to Albany, was effectively destroyed. Thousands of Raider warriors lay dead in the valley. For the first time in over 50 years, a Raider army had suffered a decisive defeat in open battle, and they would never return to avenge the loss. Immediately after the battle, Thorne did what he knew would be a message to the entire colonial world. He ordered the head of Stonehand to be placed on a spear and sent to Philadelphia, where it was displayed publicly at the gates of Market Street. Consider the symbolism of this act. Only a few months earlier, Thorne had executed the Raider envoys and displayed their heads at these very gates. The Raiders, in response, had sent their armies, utterly confident that Philadelphia would fall, just as every other kingdom that had resisted them had fallen. Instead, the head of their general now adorned the same gates, a grim reply to General Graham's threats. News of the Susquehanna Stand spread across the colonial world like wildfire. In Philadelphia, the streets erupted in jubilation. In the ruins of Pittsburgh and Albany, wherever the raiders had conquered, people began to whisper that perhaps the raiders were not invincible after all. The Iroquois did not stop at mere defense. Within days of the battle, they marched north and recaptured Pittsburgh. In less than a month, they had already retaken Albany. The Ohio Valley, under Raider control for only a few months, was once again in Native American hands. The Iroquois Confederacy continued to rule the Northeast for over 250 years. But here's where the story takes an ironic and grim turn. On his way back to Philadelphia, drunk with victory, Governor General Thorne made a fatal mistake. He had promised Chief Blackwood, the general who had devised and executed the brilliant ambush strategy, that he would be rewarded with the territory of New York as his own domain to govern. But Thorne either changed his mind or asked Chief Blackwood to wait. We don't know exactly what was said. What we do know is that Chief Blackwood, the ambitious and ruthless general who had just saved the colonial world, conspired with other Iroquois officers. On October 24th, 1260, less than 2 months after the great victory at the Susquehanna Stand, Chief Blackwood and his accomplices murdered Thorne during a hunting expedition. They claimed the murder was justified because Thorne had not kept his promises. But let's be honest about what it was. It was a murder driven by ambition and greed. Chief Blackwood then declared himself the new Governor-General of the United Colonies. And you know what? He was quite good at it. Under his rule, the Iroquois would complete the expulsion of the colonial frontiersmen from the frontier, capturing Fort Duquesne in 1291 and bringing an end to decades of frontier presence. He would repel subsequent attempts by the raiders to invade the Northeast. He would transform the Iroquois Confederacy into the dominant power in North America for generations. But I cannot help but think of Thorne. This was a man enslaved by the raiders, who had fought his way to the top through the militia system, who had made the bold decision to fight rather than surrender, who had risked everything to confront an enemy that seemed invincible. He won the battle that saved colonial civilization in the Northeast, and his reward was to be murdered by his own subordinate. History can be such a cruel mistress. It doesn't always provide the neat, morally satisfying endings that we crave. Thorne deserved to be remembered as a hero, but he died weeks after his greatest triumph, murdered by a man he had elevated and trusted. Meanwhile, in the Great Lakes region, General Graham received news of the disaster at the Susquehanna Stand. As Stonehand had predicted, he was enraged. He immediately began planning a massive invasion to avenge the defeat and finally crush the Iroquois, but he never got the chance. Remember, I mentioned Chief Geronimo, leader of the Apache Nation in the Southwest. Geronimo had converted to Christianity and was absolutely appalled by Graham's destruction of Philadelphia and the execution of Governor Thorne. He saw it as an unforgivable crime against his new faith. Furthermore, Geronimo believed that Graham had seized territories in the Southwest that rightfully belonged to the Apache. So, Geronimo did something unprecedented in intertribal history. He formed an alliance with the Iroquois against his fellow Native American leader and declared war on Guam. It was a civil war within the Native American world. Native American against Native American. In 1263, Guam led an army north to meet Geronimo. The two Native American forces clashed in the Rockies, and Guam suffered a significant defeat. He spent the rest of his days battling Geronimo's forces in the north, abandoning any plans to invade the northeast and the south, and died in 1265, never fulfilling his dream of conquering the Iroquois. His successors repeatedly attempted to reclaim the northeast. In 1300, Raider forces briefly recaptured Pittsburgh, but could not hold it. The reasons were the same as at the defeat at the Susquehanna Stand: lack of pasture for their horses, unfavorable terrain for their tactics, and Iroquois defenders who knew how to exploit those weaknesses. By 1303, after the Iroquois shattered yet another Raider invasion at the Battle of Saratoga, the Raiders had effectively abandoned any attempts to conquer the Northeast. The Susquehanna Stand marked the furthest extent of Raider expansion westward, and they would never cross that line again. Let's reflect on what the Battle of the Susquehanna Stand signifies in the broader historical context, as its consequences were felt far beyond the Northeast. Had the Raiders prevailed at the Susquehanna Stand and continued their conquest of the Northeast, the entire history of North America would have taken a different path. With the Northeast under Raider control, they would have had a springboard for invading the South. To the north, the Raiders had already reached the colonial settlements of Canada. A Raider empire stretching from the Pacific to the Gulf of Mexico would have placed the nascent United States in a deadly vice. Would the American Revolution have occurred if Raider armies threatened from the east and south? Would the era of westward expansion and manifest destiny have happened if the fledgling United States fought for survival against continuous Raider invasions? Would the indigenous cultures of North America have survived as distinct entities if their last major center of power had been destroyed? These are counterfactual questions, and we will never know the answers for certain. However, it is worth contemplating how different our world might be if Chief Blackwood had not known the terrain of the Susquehanna Valley, if the Iroquois horses had not been shod, if there had been more pasture in the Northeast, if the hills around Devil's Backbone had not provided perfect cover for an ambush. This battle also vividly demonstrates what, in my opinion, is key to understanding military history. Tactics and bravery are important, but geography and logistics often matter more. The Raiders did not lose at the Susquehanna Stand because they were bad warriors. They were superb soldiers. They did not lose due to cowardice or incompetence. They were brave and well led. They lost because their entire military system was optimized for the specific environment of the Great Plains. And when they moved to a different environment, the advantages that made them invincible became disadvantages. Their small, hardy, unshod ponies, capable of surviving any prairie condition, did not fare as well on rocky terrain as shod horses. Their strategy of vast numbers of remounts could not work in lands without sufficient grass. Their mobility advantage was negated by hills and forests. This is a lesson that military strategists have had to relearn throughout history. Tactics that work brilliantly in one environment can fail completely in another. The British learned this during the American Revolution, when their European battle formations clashed with guerrilla warfare in the forests of North America. The Americans understood this in Vietnam, when their overwhelming firepower met an enemy that controlled the jungles. The Soviets learned it in Afghanistan, when their mechanized army encountered mountain fighters who knew every pass and every valley. The Raiders were the greatest military force of their time. But they were not sorcerers. They were not unstoppable. They were men using tactics adapted to their homeland. And when they encountered an enemy who understood both their tactics and the terrain better than they did, they could be defeated. There is one other point I would like to emphasize, which I find quite curious from a historical perspective. The Iroquois won at the Susquehanna Stand by employing the Raiders' own tactics against them. Feigned retreat, ambush, using the opponent's overconfidence against them. These were all stratagems the Raiders had successfully employed for decades. Chief Blackwood, as a native warrior from the plains, had undoubtedly grown up on tales of Raider tactics. He understood how they fought because he came from the same warrior tradition. This was not a clash of East versus West, of Christianity versus Islam, or other simplistic schemes we sometimes use to understand medieval conflicts. This was a battle of steppe warriors, with the crucial difference that one side knew the terrain and the other did not. Furthermore, I believe it is important to reflect on the role of luck and coincidence in history. Had Great Khan Monkey not died in 1259, General Grom might never have left the Ohio Valley. Had he remained with his entire 100,000-man army, the Iroquois would have been outnumbered 5-1, and regardless of the terrain advantage, they likely would have been defeated. Had Chief Geronimo not converted to Christianity and allied with the Iroquois against Grom, the raiders might have been able to concentrate their forces and make another attempt. History is full of random coincidences where someone's death, a decision made, or an alliance formed completely alters the course of events. We often prefer to see clear cause and effect relationships, heroes and villains, and inevitable outcomes in stories of the past. However, reality is often far more complex and depends far more on luck than we are willing to admit. Nevertheless, I do not wish to diminish the bravery and skill of the Iroquois warriors who fought at the Susquehanna Stand. Their opponent possessed a terrifying reputation, having destroyed every kingdom that resisted them. The Iroquois understood that if Philadelphia fell, they would likely face the same fate as Pittsburgh, complete annihilation. They fought with all their might and achieved victory, combining courage with intellect, bravery with strategy, and Thorne, despite the tragic end to his story, deserves recognition for his bold decision to fight rather than surrender. It would have been easy to justify capitulation. The raiders had offered him to keep his throne as a vassal. He could have argued that he was saving Iroquois lives by avoiding battle, but he chose to fight, and that choice preserved colonial civilization in the Northeast. Today, if you visit the site of the Susquehanna Stand, you will find agricultural fields in the vast expanse of central Pennsylvania. There are no grand monuments or tourist centers with gift shops and audio guides. The exact location of the battle is still somewhat uncertain, as medieval chroniclers were not precise with their coordinates. However, the spring still exists, and the hills still encircle the valley. And if you stand on the slopes of the Appalachian Mountains and look out at the Susquehanna Valley, you can imagine what Thorne saw that September morning in 1260. The valley floor, capable of tempting any cavalry general, the hills perfect for an ambush, and the approach of an army that believed itself invincible. The story of the Susquehanna Stand serves as a reminder that any empire, however powerful, has its limits. These limits may be geographical, logistical, or political, but they exist. The Raider Empire, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the eastern seaboard, found its western frontier in a rocky valley in Pennsylvania, where the hooves of their horses met terrain unfamiliar to them. It is also a reminder that knowledge of local conditions can be as important as numerical superiority or superior weaponry. Chief Blackwood knew the terrain intimately. He understood where to hide an army, where to set an ambush, how to exploit the weaknesses that rocky soil would create for unshod horses. This local knowledge, multiplied by the courage to apply it, made all the difference. And perhaps most importantly, the Susquehanna Stand reminds us that history is made by choices. Thorne chose to fight rather than surrender. Chief Blackwood chose a risky ambush over an open battle with the raiders. General Stonehand chose to pursue the retreating Iroquois, suspecting no trap. Each of these choices had consequences that echoed through history. Before I conclude, I would like to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me, do you believe Chief Blackwood's murder of Thorne was justified, or was it the betrayal of a hero? Do you think the raiders could have conquered the East Coast if they had defeated the Iroquois? What other battles in history, in your opinion, deserve such in-depth exploration? Your comments actually help me decide what to cover next. So, don't be shy. If you enjoyed this video, please do 3 things. First, hit that like button. It truly helps more people discover these stories. Second, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because I am preparing even more of these stories about battles, technologies, and strange geographical features that change the course of history. And third, share this video with someone who loves history, because stories like these are too good to keep to yourself. Remember, the secret to defeating the raiders was not a superweapon or a miracle. It was horseshoes, grass, and rocky hills. It was brilliantly applied local knowledge. It was the understanding that the ground beneath your feet can be as important as the sword in your hand. The raiders conquered the largest land empire in history, but at the Susquehanna Stand, they learned that there is always land that even the greatest army cannot cross. Sometimes, terrain dictates destiny.